Hello there. In this video I will be dealing with the subject of Joseph Rutherford and specifically the allegations that he was a womanizer. Now the first thing to say right off the bat is that there is absolutely no hard evidence that Joseph Rutherford was an adulterer. However, I believe the matter still merits consideration for the following two reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, there are the high moral standards that Jehovah's Witnesses have in their religion today. Now, interestingly, despite writing 21 books and scores of booklets and Watchtower articles, Joseph Rutherford wrote comparatively little on the issue of sexual immorality. He was really more interested in vilifying religion and discussing Bible prophecy. It was only some time after Rutherford's death that the organisation really started to take sexual immorality seriously, and 10 years after Rutherford's death, in 1952, the disfellowshipping practice was introduced. Secondly, there's the teaching of the faithful and discreet slave. According to current Jehovah's Witness teachings, between 1914 and 1919, Jesus Christ inspected and cleansed the Watchtower Society, and in 1919 chose its board of directors, headed by Joseph Rutherford, to be his faithful and discreet slave. Jehovah's Witnesses therefore have every right to expect high moral standards of a man who the governing body insists was handpicked by Jesus Christ himself to deliver spiritual food to God's people at that time. Now, as I've already mentioned, there is no hard evidence that Joseph Rutherford was an adulterer. If Rutherford was an adulterer, for obvious reasons, it wouldn't be a smart move for him to issue a written confession, and he would obviously be very careful that there was no audio or film evidence catching him in the act. Having said that, I'm going to present you with 3 lines of evidence that I believe hint very strongly that Rutherford was indeed a philanderer, and I'm happy to let you decide how you interpret this information. Firstly, I'm going to play you this video clip, which is a recorded experience by my fellow activist Barbara Anderson. In the clip, Barbara relates visiting Rutherford's former home Beth Sarim sometime in 1993, 50 years after Rutherford's death. Barbara relates how she tried to change the subject when the then owner of Beth Sarim tried to tell her something about the sordid history of the property.
The owner and I began to talk about Rutherford. I asked, amongst other things, where was the hillside crypt that the judge was supposed to be buried in before the San Diego County Commission said no. He pointed in the direction where, later on, we saw a small building. And then he asked if I knew where Rutherford was really buried. I said, of course, yes, in Staten Island, New York. He said, no way. He was very emphatic. He said, you are standing on him. I laughed. I looked down. I looked around. We all had quizzical looks on our face, I'm sure. And he said, I mean it. You're standing on the judge. They didn't want him in New York. And so his followers buried him in this garage. The concrete was poured over him. I asked him how he knew. And he said, Jehovah's Witnesses, older Jehovah's Witnesses who were connected closely with Rutherford and participated in the burial, told him after he had purchased the house. Then he pointed in the distance and he told us that when he bought Beth Sarim, there were 7 small cabins located on the property where the judge kept his women. And if we walked over to the area, he said we could still see the foundation slabs of concrete where the cabins were. Well, we really laughed. Well, we were embarrassed. We didn't know what to say, so I changed the subject. I asked him if he would take a minute and show us around.
Now obviously what we have here amounts to hearsay. It's one person's story of another person's story of what may or may not have happened at Beth Sarim. Having said that, it's worth recognising that if Barbara Anderson really wanted to frame Joseph Rutherford as an adulterer, she could have added a lot more detail to make this story more scandalous. Instead, we're treated to a passing mention by the owner that Rutherford kept women at the property, to which Barbara responds by quickly trying to change the subject. I believe that if Barbara made up this story, which I don't think she did, she certainly could have done a better job. This leaves the possibility that the owner was lying, but firstly, since he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, there wouldn't have been a motive for him to concoct such a story. And secondly, his story does add up with other lines of evidence. This brings me to Exhibit B, which is an interview between writer Jerry Bergman and Hayden Covington, who for many years was Watchtower's lead attorney and was very much part of Rutherford's inner circle. Bergman is the author of this book, which is Jehovah's Witnesses, a comprehensive and selectively annotated bibliography, and in 1974 he visited Covington while Covington was disfellowshipped. Incidentally, Covington was disfellowshipped in 1963 for his drinking, but he was reinstated shortly before he died in 1978, and Bergman managed to visit him while he was disfellowshipped to ask him a few questions. Now, I'll put a link to Bergman's article in the description so you can read it for yourself, but I just want to read you the relevant part of his article where he asks Covington about Rutherford and the possible claims that he was an adulterer. Bergman writes, "It became very clear that he, that's Covington, idolised Rutherford. For example, I knew that Rutherford's wife had a stroke and that she wasn't in good health. She died in 1962, and I asked about the philandering rumours. Covington was laying down when I asked him about this, and immediately sat up and was obviously very, very angry. He looked at me and said, 'If your wife was paralysed, what would you do?' I immediately knew I better not pursue that line of questioning. He seemed to acknowledge that Rutherford did have paramours, but defended him to the hilt. I also asked him, who wrote the articles in the Watchtower? He answered, Rutherford, who had help but alone was responsible." Now again, as with Barbara Anderson, it's perfectly possible that Jerry Bergman could have been just completely making up this account. But if that's the case and he was doing so to paint Rutherford in a bad light, again, he could have done a much better job of doing so. Exhibit C, the third and final piece of evidence I'm going to leave you with, is the rumours surrounding a woman named Berta Peel. Now, if you Google her name, if you Google Joseph Rutherford and Berta Peel, I'll put the spelling in the description below, you should be able to come up with quite a lot of information because her story has been discussed quite extensively on XJW forums. But I have yet to see the story of Berta treated in quite the scholarly way that it is treated by Jim Penton in his book Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich. Now this is a fantastic book that I would recommend to anybody. Jim Penton does a fantastic job of analysing Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly in the 1930s, surrounding the Second World War. And while writing about that period, Penton spends a little bit of time talking about Rutherford and some of the rumours surrounding him at that time. On page 102 and 103, he deals with this story of Berta Peel, and it's quite a long section, so I hope you'll bear with me while I read it, but I think it's rather damning in relation to this matter. He writes on page 102, "There is also strong circumstantial evidence that he, that's Rutherford, was somewhat of a womanizer and may have had a mistress in the last years of his life. Regarding Rutherford's possible womanizing, Peter Moyle has written, it has also been known, albeit carefully covered, that Rutherford liked his women and his whiskey. In support of this allegation, family members of Rutherford's female dietitian and nurse are convinced she was his mistress. The woman in question, a Mrs. Berta Peel, was a close friend of Bonnie Boyd, Rutherford's stenographer. She accompanied Boyd to a Watchtower convention in Europe at some point in the mid or late 1930s. At that convention, she evidently met Rutherford. Thereafter, in June 1938, she abandoned her non-Jehovah's Witness husband of 15 years and moved to Brooklyn Bethel, where at least outwardly she became Rutherford's dietitian and nurse. In November 1939, her husband, Albert Peel, filed for a divorce from her. It was granted in March 1940. Naturally, these facts raised serious questions. Why did Rutherford accept her at Bethel when she had openly deserted her husband? Such behaviour was in clear violation of biblical teachings as understood by Jehovah's Witnesses. Why did the judge make her his nurse and dietitian when he already had a male nurse and when she had no formal training as either a dietitian or a nurse? And why, finally, did he take Mrs. Peel, an attractive Southern belle, with him wherever he went? That was something he did not do with his male nurse, Matthew Howlett. Another strong indication that Rutherford may have been sexually adventurous is that his wife obviously felt quite bitter toward him. She had not lived with him for many years. His excuse was that she was an invalid and could not give him his marital dues. However, there was more to the matter than that. He seldom, if ever, bothered to visit her. So when he was dying of cancer, both she and their son Malcolm practically ignored him, even though both were living nearby in Southern California. Now, probably like me, after reading that, you're thinking, well, that's actually rather damning. He had this attractive woman who divorced her husband after arriving at Bethel. He had this attractive woman follow him around everywhere as his dietitian and nurse, even though he already had a male nurse. There would have been loads of opportunities for them to be sexually adventurous together. But you're probably like me thinking, well, at best, that's still just circumstantial evidence. The fact that they were traveling together all the time doesn't mean they actually had sex. But the interesting thing is, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, is that circumstantial evidence is considered by elders to be grounds for disfellowshipping when it comes to adultery. And to prove it, I'm going to read to you from page 129 of the Shepherd, the Flock of God book. Page 129.12, it says, "In some cases adultery is not proved, but it is established by confession or by two or more witnesses that the mate stayed all night in the same house with a person of the opposite sex or a known homosexual under improper circumstances. The elders should carefully consider the situation. Were the individuals together all night? Were improper circumstances involved? For example, were the two persons alone? Is there evidence of a romantic relationship? What were the sleeping arrangements? Even if adultery is not established, it may be that the Christian was involved in an immoral sleeping arrangement." And I would submit that based on what we know about this Berta Peel and the fact that she travelled everywhere with Rutherford, I think nowadays Rutherford would have been disfellowshipped for adultery. I really do, regardless of whether he'd actually been caught in the act or not. At the bare minimum, you can say with total confidence that Joseph Rutherford was no role model when it came to marriage. And if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, you would do well to honestly ask yourself the question, is it reasonable to assume that Jesus Christ would select Joseph Rutherford to be among the first and most prominent members of his faithful and discreet slave, when at best he had a terrible relationship with his wife, who couldn't be bothered visiting him when he was on his deathbed, and at worst he was very likely a philanderer and womanizer? I will leave you to ponder that question along with the information I've presented, and as always, thank you for watching.